I just need to know why this is not required reading. So I read Policing Black Lives, which details state violence in Canada from slavery to present by Robyn Maynard. Let's talk about it. Hi there, my name is Vanessa, and welcome back to my channel. On here, I provide book recommendations, book reviews, and I sprinkle some hauls in there as well. I'm currently documenting my reading journey where I'm making a book review on every single book I read in 2026. If that's your vibe, don't forget to subscribe, and let's get into the review. So, as mentioned, I recently read Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard, which details state violence in Canada from slavery to present. In case you didn't know, I am Canadian, and in case you couldn't tell, I am a Black Canadian. Now, in Canada, we do have a problem. There is a severe and significant lack of literature, research, and overall scholarship when it comes to the Black Canadian experience and Black Canadian history overall. Oftentimes, it feels like policymakers depend on the research that comes out of the United States to inform their understanding of Black Canadian life and Black Canadian experience and history within Canada. Now, this is fundamentally problematic, right? Because the history of the two countries is different, the context is different, the culture is different, and the overall society is different. Black people in Canada experience a different form of racism that's unique to its own history. And Robyn sort of talks about this. She talks about the importance of having a unique understanding of Blackness within the Canadian context and one that is rooted in Canadian history. Now, the second problem, right, is the idea, the myth, the notion that Canada somehow is this anti racist or post racist society, right? Without a history of slavery. We were the heroes in the narrative and history and institution of slavery. We never partook in slavery, but that's incorrect. Slavery absolutely existed in Canada. And Robyn, who actually is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, she teaches on Black feminism in Canada. Robyn really details the history of slavery in Canada from its inception, because wink, wink, slavery absolutely existed in Canada all the way to the present. And she really details how different institutions and different systems that form and make up Canadian society have always had anti-Black racism embedded. Of course, the third problem is more policy related, because when there is a lack of research, when there's a lack of statistics and literature and scholarship on the Black Canadian experience, inevitably that's going to create policy gaps. If we don't have the research to support policy implementation, it's going to create gaps, and we're not going to be able to effectively address or solve or rectify the material conditions that Black people in Canada face. Lack of research equals policy gaps. But I'm not going to get too academic, okay? Because this book certainly doesn't read textbook. It's very approachable, it's very accessible. I feel like she wrote this book thinking of a very wide audience. I feel like if you're Black, you're going to gain a lot of knowledge. If you're POC, you're going to gain a lot of knowledge. If you're a high school student, you're going to gain a lot of knowledge. Certainly, if you're a university student, for example, you will gain a lot of knowledge. And especially if you are white, you will gain a lot of knowledge. So, yeah, if you are unfamiliar with the socio-political realities of Black people in Canada, we do go through racism. Racism absolutely exists here. Anti Black racism was a term that was actually coined by a Black Canadian. Dr. Akua Benjamin was actually looking for a unique term to describe the very unique racism that she was experiencing in Canada. So, yeah, racism is a thing here. Okay, it's very embedded in our society. In any case, let's actually get to the meat of this book. So, like I mentioned, Robyn starts at 1629, right? The inception of slavery in Canada. And she really takes the time for the first couple of chapters to identify the ways in which slavery was different. It's not to say that it didn't exist, it just existed different. Slavery in Canada was on a smaller scale. And because of its terrain, right? Canada's a lot colder, not a lot of people, it's more sparse. Because of its terrain, it also looked different. Essentially, slavery in Canada was relegated to domestic servitude. So African slaves were forced to perform domestic labor for their masters, as opposed to what we understand and know to be American history, where there were agricultural plantations that the slaves were working on. So it looked different, but it's not to say that it didn't exist, and it's not to say that it wasn't as brutal. In fact, Robyn talks about the fact that because slavery in Canada was relegated to domestic servitude, it was more alienating for African slaves and highly isolationist, right? And that sort of isolation and alienation made slavery an even more brutal industry and practice in Canada, because when African slaves were isolated from other slaves or they were isolated from the rest of their community, they were subjected to more brutal retaliation from their masters, to torture, to physical punishment, right? Because of the lack of interconnectedness and community, right? They were isolated and alienated, which gave way to an oftentimes more brutal experience. And she also spends time detailing how slavery was abolished in Canada and what that process looked like. But after slavery was abolished, the material conditions of Black Canadians didn't improve. From slavery, we get segregation, which is something else that a lot of people don't know existed in Canada. We believe that Jim Crow is only an American reality, right? And it didn't exist in Canada, but that's so wrong. It's so false. Segregation laws were enacted all across Canada, okay? There were white only sections, schools were segregated, movie theaters were segregated. We hear a lot about Viola Desmond, for example, who refused to leave a segregated movie theater in Nova Scotia. I mean, segregation was a reality in Canada. And more to that, something that I was never taught in schools, for example, is the fact that segregation existed until 1983. In fact, the last segregated school in Canada closed in 1983 in Nova Scotia. Robyn spends a good amount of time on segregation laws and what that looked like for Black Canadians. And then she talks about how a lot of the modern day institutions, right, our immigration system, our school system, our justice system, although they were being legislated by these newfound policies such as multiculturalism and all of the policies that supposedly welcomed all of these Black migrants and immigrants, although we were sort of operating under a more multicultural lens, Robyn actually argues that these modern day institutions simply reincarnated our enslavement and our subjugation. One of my favorite arguments that she makes is this idea that in modern day times, right, no Canadian is going to say that they're racist. It's not socially acceptable to say, hey, yeah, I'm a racist. However, a lot of Canadians, because of this myth, right, because of this national myth that a lot of Canadians hold, they don't understand how their racial bias is rooted in a history of slavery. And that's just it, right? Because Robyn talks so much about how all of these stereotypes that we have of Black people are rooted in slavery. Okay. And so if we are going to say that, hey, I'm not racist because it's socially unacceptable, we also have to challenge the biases that we do hold that are fundamentally rooted in slavery. I mean, the chapters alone are a good indicator of what's in store for you if you pick up this book. She has a chapter on the shifting languages of domination, Black subjugation as multiculturalism. From stolen people to stolen resources, the origins of Black displacement. She does make mention of Africville. I think as Canadians, we're familiar with the history of Africville, which was an all Black settlement that was destroyed by the city of Halifax. She talks about the state's role in impoverishing Black communities. She talks about law enforcement violence against Black women. And she has a section for the various Black women that have been killed or murdered or injured and maimed at the hands of police. The racialization of crime, no freedom to circulate, police profiling, and the restriction of Black movement. Canada's war on drugs, something else that we believe to be uniquely American. Black incarceration, the destruction of Black bodies, police violence and impunity from the street to the courthouse, the violence of captivity, Black life behind bars. And she really does talk about the criminalization of Black people and Black communities, the over-policing of Black communities. I mean, every single subcategory that you could imagine when it comes to the scholarship of slavery and Black history is in this book. Now, a couple of things that I absolutely loved. I absolutely loved how intersectional this book is. If you're familiar with social justice and the scholarship of social justice and liberation, you know how important it is to approach each thought, theory from an intersectional lens. And Robyn Maynard does this so well. She doesn't just talk about Black men being victims of police brutality and over policing. She talks about Black women and how their experiences are different and unique to the experiences of Black Black men. She draws so many similarities to the history of the Indigenous people in Canada to that of Black Canadians. She makes the point that although our histories are distinct and unique, they are also similar and they sort of occurred in a parallel fashion. A specific quote that I remember is when Robyn talks about how the Indigenous community was a community that had to be eliminated. And that's how we get, the genocide of the Indigenous people of Canada. Whereas the Black community was something to be feared. And that's how we got this need to police and over police Black Canadians and the need to regulate our communities and impose all of these laws that would restrict our movements and restrict our ability to just exist. And so I do love that. I appreciate that because it is truly intersectional, right? And then when Robyn lands on present day Canada and what the present day realities are for Black Canadians, she constantly roots her present day understanding in the unique history of slavery in Canada and really truly highlights how the history and the past has informed our present. And this idea and this premise and this thesis that anti Black racism has been foundational to Canada's creation as a nation and essential for its continued existence, much in the same vein that Canada's creation as a nation is rooted in the elimination of its Indigenous population, and the removal of that Indigenous population continues to be essential for Canada's existence as a country. Both of those realities are distinct, but are certainly parallel. And that's essentially the crux of her argument. I mean, it is so good. It is so good. I am someone that considers themselves very well versed when it comes to matters of racism and classism and sexism and gender and how all these systems of power and systems of oppression intersect with one another to create these unique lived experiences. I consider myself very well versed. And even I, okay, learned a lot. I learned so much. I mean, this was fantastic. I would definitely give it a 5 star. I mean, it's not without its imperfections. For example, I do feel like the book at times is a little redundant, but at the same time, I think that redundancy was intentional because it's so important to consistently and constantly highlight the ways in which the past informs the present. And I think that that's what she was doing, but it did feel at times like it was redundant and certain arguments were reinstated and restated. But again, maybe it was intentional. Also, I can't help but feel when I finished the book, I felt sad and hopeless. Her concluding chapter wasn't really a path for the future or, ways that we can kind of improve society. And maybe that speaks to the bleak reality that a racial utopia isn't possible, especially if we do not effectively and actively challenge all of the systems of oppression that continue to subjugate and marginalize historically marginalized communities. I did feel a little sad, a little hopeless. Learning about the history of my people, specifically in this country, was eye-opening. It was insightful. And it was powerful too. Like I did feel empowered with all of this newfound information and newfound knowledge. I live the Black experience every day. I'm very aware of it, but I do believe that there's a difference between having knowledge based on lived experience and then having knowledge through research and through reading and through understanding things outside of your personal lived context. I think this is mandatory reading. I think this is required reading. I felt like, why wasn't this taught in schools? I had no idea that there was a ban on Black medical students. And I keep thinking about all the generations of Black doctors that we lost because Queen's University decided to ban Black medical students. I had no idea about the extent of segregation laws in Canada and the fact that, the last segregated school closed its doors in 1983. Something else that I had no idea about that really stuck with me was the violence against Black women in Canada at the hands of police, something else that I've never really looked into. This stuff isn't taught in schools. And I recommend, if you are an educator and you are watching my video, I recommend that this be part of the school curriculum, okay? Certainly at the high school level, definitely at the post-secondary level. If you're in university and maybe you're writing a research paper or, you just want to learn more about the Black Canadian experience, I definitely recommend picking this up. It's approachable, it's uniquely Canadian. The language was accessible, and I feel like anyone would benefit from reading this book. It was a fantastic read, definitely a 5-star read. I love nonfiction, okay, especially when it's accessible. It doesn't feel like homework, it doesn't feel dense. I definitely recommend it. And yeah, amazing read. Look how many times I annotated and sticky tapped. I mean, Amazing read. In any case, that is it for today's review. Let me know if you appreciated the review, if you learned something new, and if you're going to put this book on your TBR. I do want to thank you for watching if you've stayed the course, and I will see you in my next video. Adios.